Hello and welcome to Overtime Hockey Talk. My name is Mark Paul. My co-host Justin Baker joining me via Skype. Justin, how are you on this wonderful Saturday morning?
I'm doing great. Starting to warm up. Spring might be coming. It's mid-40s here, so we're getting a heat wave.
Hey, all I know, all the snow in my backyard is melting, and now my dogs are covered in mud. So that's that's really fun. And then it'll all freeze again, and my backyard will be ready for a hockey game. So
beautiful.
Just come on over, bring your goalie equipment, and there might be a few holes in the ice, but just know it's on solid foundation, a nice sod foundation. So obviously today's show, we're 48 hours out from trade deadline. Well, maybe more like 56 or something like that, but we're very close. We're 2 days away from the trade deadline officially happening. So very soon will our show no longer be about trades. Who are we kidding? We'll keep talking about trades even after the trade deadline, but we will certainly be focused in on the trade deadline for today's show. We're going to run through some of the deals made over the last week since our last show, and then we will get to the meat of what we think will happen. We want to hone in on teams that are kind of on that playoff bubble, what they might do. I think they're maybe the most interesting. We know that Tampa Bay is always in on a guy. Nashville, especially now that Duchene has gone off to Columbus, we know they'll be in on something else. There's all these top teams are looking for something, but it's maybe more up in the air what a potential playoff team will do just to get into the playoffs. How desperate are they for the playoffs? So let's start with these trades. And I know we said we wouldn't talk about it, but let's just, for sake of the fact that it happened right after our show last week, the Vancouver Canucks acquire Ryan Spooner from the Oilers for Sam Gagner. Any thoughts on why this move happened?
Yeah, Spooner wasn't really working out in Edmonton, and I think being able to swap for nearly identical cap hits and term 1 year left each after this year, I think the Oilers thought, hey, maybe we can bring in a guy who can potentially be a decent third line center for us and a guy we're familiar with. And for Spooner, it's just an opportunity to get a fresh start for like the 18th time, and maybe it works out in Vancouver. Yeah,
at some point you have to stop thinking that a guy needs a fresh start, and you just have to come to terms with who he is. Sam Gagner did have 8 points for the Oilers one game. I don't know if you remember that one. But,
yes, I do.
That's the one thing that he did that Gretzky didn't. I think was an 8-point game. The Chicago Blackhawks scooped former Toronto Maple Leaf Peter Holland for Darren Radish. Chicago obviously just looking to have some depth forwards. That's really the spot that they've been struggling in, and so Peter Holland doesn't really bring too much to the table. But just kind of one of your run-of-the-mill swaps. We'll just move past that one on to a more significant deal. The Bruins acquire Charlie Coyle from the Wild for Ryan Donato and a 5th-round pick, which is a conditional 5th, on whether the Bruins, depending on how far the Bruins go in the playoffs, determines what that pick becomes. Your thoughts on this deal?
Yeah, I think Boston definitely needed some depth scoring in order to compete with the Torontos and the Tampas of the East, and they definitely are going to get a guy who is not only big but can score a few goals. And I think for Minnesota, they're starting, I don't want to call it a retool, but they're starting to get a little bit younger with guys like this. Not that Charlie Coyle was old by any means, but I think they're moving on from a guy like Coyle who maybe just didn't really work out quite the way the Wild thought he could. And for the Bruins, like I said, they get a guy who can probably come in and be a good third-line center for them.
Yeah, my guess is right now the Bruins are looking at the standings and they're going, all right, well, we're playing the Leafs in the first round. The chances of that happening are high. Whether it's just going to matter who has home ice advantage. But it looks like the way things are shaping up, the Bruins are. It's going to be an exact rematch of last year. Bruins 2, Leafs 3, and you've got to be thinking that the Bruins are going, all right, why did we beat the Leafs last year? And what what has beaten the Leafs this season, and it's been teams that have size and are throwing the Leafs around a little bit, and the Leafs don't really have an answer for it. And so bringing in a guy like Charlie Coyle, to me, is an exact response to, all right, great, Leafs went out and got Jake Muzzin. He's a little bit more of a sandpaper type of defenseman, well, also being highly skilled. And they answer with, well, let's bring in Charlie Coyle. They've been missing that third line center all year long, and he's a guy who he may not play like a big guy, but he does bring size to the table, something that the Leafs have struggled with. And so I got to be thinking that both these teams are thinking, how do we beat each other? Which was, Jake Muzzin was a good response to, how do we beat the Bruins? Well, we need to get a defenseman who can play and can play that style of game. And the Bruins went right back and went out and got some more size. So I think when you look at both those teams, you got to be thinking, how do we beat each other? Because that's the first step. I mean, you can prepare to beat Tampa Bay. I don't know if anybody's going to beat Tampa Bay, but you can prepare to beat them. Of course, any move you make to make your team more deep is going to help. But at this point, you've got to be thinking of your first round matchup, or at least those potential teams you'll play. And I think if there's one first round matchup that's guaranteed, it's Leafs and Bruins. I'll probably eat my words for that one, but it certainly looks like that's what's going to happen. The Washington Capitals scoop Carl Hagelin, his second team, he's on his third team now in about 4 or 5 months, and he gets him from the Kings after he was already in Pittsburgh. They get him for a third and a conditional sixth. What do you think? How do you think Hagelin will fit in with the Capitals? And maybe this leads to a larger discussion as to what the Capitals are trying to do here at the deadline.
Yeah, I mean, you saw they put Devontae Smith-Pelly. I think he hasn't been quite the goal scorer point guy that they thought he was come playoff time last year, when he really stepped up with 7 goals and I think 2 assists in the playoffs. And I think they're worried that maybe he's not going to be able to repeat that performance. And they're worried about depth. When you got to go against teams in the East like Tampa Bay and Toronto that have a lot of depth, right? You would think that eventually in the conference finals, where I'm thinking the Capitals are anticipating this move to really pay off, is when you have to have those third and fourth lines being able to score. And I think Carl Hagelin adds a lot of speed, and he still, I don't know if maybe it was LA, but he still has the ability. I mean, granted, he did a lot of his point producing in Pittsburgh. We're hoping that, maybe a third line setup for him with maybe Lars Eller might work out pretty well. And then, he's shown too that he can also keep up with, the more skilled players. So if they have to move him up to the first or second line, it's still a possibility.
Yeah, I'll say this, that Carl Hagelin never looked comfortable in Los Angeles, and he comes back to the East. Certainly Washington is much more like Pittsburgh than it is like LA, right. So I think that maybe that helps him. Maybe he, just the familiarity of the conference and the location, maybe that just helps him play better. Although it would be very interesting if we see Washington play Pittsburgh in the first round, and there's in a roundabout way, the Penguins traded him to the Capitals. So yeah, the Capitals, to me, I think they're still looking to make another move. Maybe obviously they did make another move. We'll skip ahead here. We'll jump a couple trades. Yesterday, they not only did they acquire Nick Jensen and a 5th round pick from the Red Wings for Madison Bowie and a 2020 second round pick, the Capitals go right ahead and sign Nick Jensen to a 4-year, $10 million deal. So they were, not only were they looking for Nick Jensen as a rental, they're looking at Nick Jensen and going, like, we want you long term. We think that you fit our system right away.
Yeah, I mean, first off, he's a right-handed shot, which are very highly coveted, and I think Washington could definitely use that, because outside of Carlson, I don't think they have much.
Oh, this kid is a right-handed shot.
But I mean, to be quite honest, he's I don't want to say he's fallen off a little bit, but he is not as good as he was the last couple seasons for Washington. I think Jensen has the ability to still move the puck, so he's a guy who could maybe slot in on that second power play unit if Niskanen really isn't panning out, or maybe they need to change things up a little bit. And to be quite honest, I mean, they must have had their eye on a guy like Jensen for a while, because to go out a couple hours later after trading for him and sign him to that deal was quite shocking. I was a little surprised by that.
Right. Yeah. You usually don't see that for the we'll say the lesser impact of players. He's definitely a bottom pairing guy. What I do like about him as well, I mean, there's a lot of talk about having guys on their correct side of their stick and just how much of a difference it can make just with that split second and the power on your forehand. Well, now the Capitals have Karlsson, Niskanen, and Jensen all on the right side. And what that's going to do is it's, of course, Orlov's on the left, Kempney's on the left, and you have Brooks Orpik and Christian Juice to choose from. And, it wouldn't surprise me if this maybe allows them to... I don't think that Brooks Orpik, I don't think the plan is to not have him play, especially come playoff time, but it maybe gives them an opportunity to scratch him as a healthy scratch down the stretch when they maybe don't need him to play, or they go, well, this is a lot faster team. And so Brooks Orpik, we're going to choose Nick Jensen over Orpik, and then maybe there's a game where it's a little heavier and they go with Orpik over Jensen or over Christian Juice. And so I think you'll see this depth play out in the end of the season, especially with Brooks Orpik. He's 38 years old. He is coming off a long run last year, and so it would be nice to be able to rest him down the stretch. I don't think that it can be understated how much a little bit extra rest can help leading into the playoffs, because Brooks Orpik will be he will be played in the playoffs, for better or for worse. They see him as a playoff guy. So
for sure.
So he'll be in the lineup come playoffs. I just think that he's better served if he's playing, if he's resting every fourth or fifth game along the way. Okay, well let's go to the biggest move. February 22nd. Of course, we know the Florida Panthers have acquired Vincent Prattland from the San Jose Sharks for nothing more than the beautiful future considerations. And I just want to, for a second, just camp out on those future considerations, because sometimes you get future and sometimes you get considerations. Sometimes you get them both, and that's when the Sharks, they've got a lot of future and a lot of considerations on their hands. So big move for the San Jose Sharks. Okay, anyway, so the Columbus Blue Jackets, of course, they have acquired Matt Duchene and Julius Bergman from the Ottawa Senators. Julius Bergman, not a bad bottom pairing guy. For Vitaly Abramov, Jonathan Davidson, a 2019 or a 2020 first round pick, and a conditional first round pick if Duchene re-signs in Columbus. So a pretty heavy price to pay for a rental. Obviously, there's some thought that he'll re-sign in Columbus. I don't know if you do this deal without thinking he's going to re-sign, but we both had separate opinions on what may happen moving forward. Before we get to the moving forward, what do you think of this deal?
I think for Columbus, they're gearing up for a long playoff run. I know we talked about it a bit. They were, basically an overtime away from putting the Capitals on the brink of elimination. And you look at a guy, I look at this move and look at a guy like Alex Winberg, for example, why they made this move. Because granted, he was pretty good last year, but this year he's just been a complete bust of a second line center. And I think that if they have any shot at going deep in the playoffs at all, I think, having a solid number two center is, what they needed more than anything else. And, we know they've got the depth on defense. We know they've got the Vezina goaltender back there. So, again, the center position to me is where they needed more focus than anything else. And, I wasn't going to be, if I was Columbus, I wasn't going to be relying on Riley Nash maybe to come up either. and fill in at that second line center. So a guy like Matt Duchene, again, gives you options, right? You can play him at your top line. You can play him at your second line if you feel like it. You can mix up things a little bit and kind of spread out the offense, and you don't have to rely so much on, Pierre-Luc Dubois, Cam Atkinson, and Panarin now to really get it done.
Yeah, my question is, do you split up Atkinson and Panarin and you give one to each centerman? Or are they going to put a guy like Boone Jenner and maybe maybe you move, I don't know, maybe you move Wenberg to the wing, or is Wenberg maybe goes down to that third line center position? Does that make Riley Nash your fourth line center? There's a few options that they have. What I'm worried about, Matt Duchene has had a great season thus far, but he's been playing with Matt Stone, he's been playing with Stone all season long. So I'm wondering how much his great season has to do with playing with Stone, and does who he plays with in Columbus, is it not going to look quite as fancy as he did in Ottawa? And so this move to me I'm really wondering. I'm back and forth. Do they take this move, and is it them going on a long run, or is it them going, okay, we got a guy. We obviously, before you trade for him, you're talking to, you've gotten permission to talk to him about, like, would you consider re-signing here? Like, what's your numbers? And like, you're already laying out the table, because if a guy goes, there's absolutely no way I'm going to re-sign there, then they wouldn't have given up those assets for him. So I think you're going to see Duchene sign long term in Columbus. But does this mean that Artemi Panarin is on his way out, because they can essentially recoup all the assets that they sent out for Duchene in exchange for Panarin?
Yeah, this one's going to be tough. I think maybe not necessarily the thought process of trading Panarin, but I think they bring in Duchene in the thought process that, hey, you know what, if and when Panarin leaves this offseason, if we, decide not to trade him, Duchene is that guy that can kind of fill in those missing points that we're going to lose when Panarin leaves. Now, granted, it sucks if you decide to keep Panarin and you don't get anything back for him, and now you've given up, a couple first rounders and some assets for him. But at the same time, I think right now, as a fan base, you give the hope that, hey, we can go out and we can win a playoff round or two and finally be, the last NHL team to go out and win a playoff round.
Yeah, there is one thing that I'm, Columbus is right now, they're sitting third in the Metro. 71 points. The Penguins tied with 71 with them. Obviously, if the Penguins, they are technically two wins away, because they have to, they have a game in hand, the Blue Jackets do. So potentially the Penguins have to get 3 points to jump them here. But let's assume that Pittsburgh figures it out a little bit. They don't keep going under 500, and maybe here at the end of the season they go out at the deadline and they acquire a little bit of depth, set themselves up here. To me, the Blue Jackets, how far are they from finishing with one of the wild cards? In which case, what if they have to play Tampa Bay? You think the Columbus Blue Jackets, even if they keep Panarin and Duchene and Bobrovsky, that they can beat Tampa Bay? Because I don't think so.
I think if it goes 7, they have no chance. However, I would give them maybe a 20-25% chance they could beat Tampa Bay, just because their back end, they have the depth on D to do it, and they've got the 2-time Vezina winning goaltender back there, Bobrovsky. And I think who's
been one of the worst playoff goaltenders
right
over the last 10 years.
I will give you that, but I do think if he does get hot, finally, and with that defense, I do think they could take Tampa Bay for a lengthy playoff series, and maybe a guy like Duchene, and if they decide to keep Panarin, could be could help them in making the difference there, and potentially beating a team like Tampa Bay.
I know they didn't have Matt Duchene, but just 5 days ago, the Lightning beat the Blue Jackets 5-1. So there is that.
Not pretty.
Well, that's all the trades that we have there. Let's take a look maybe at some of these playoff runs. Whether you think some of these teams will make a move to try and, just clinch this playoff spot and see if maybe I have to think that maybe if you think you can get into that first wild card spot, the teams are looking at the Islanders and going, okay, you're having a nice regular season. Is this real? Like, is this, are you a team that can actually win the playoffs, or is this just, you're putting together a really nice season, you're beating the teams you should, you're playing great defense, but come playoff time when goals dry up anyways, this team that can, they're towards the bottom of the conference, only a few teams have less goals than them, and there's no playoff team in the East with less goals, or the only team in the West with less is the Minnesota Wild, and I don't expect them to be in the playoffs when all is said and done. So the Islanders are maybe the least scary team in terms of a division winner in the league.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I think if you're a team trying to get in that wild card spot, you're trying to hop that number 2 and get that top wild card spot so you can face a team like the Islanders come first round, because that obviously, again, if you got to play Tampa Bay or the Islanders, you're like, okay, I'm going to take the Islanders 10 times out of 10.
Sure. Yeah, imagine, I'm just picturing, maybe Pittsburgh gets that wild card spot. Pittsburgh and the Islanders in the first round. You can see Pittsburgh beating the Islanders in the playoffs. And then they get, Washington or Columbus in the next round. And maybe Pittsburgh has an easier ride to the finals or to the conference finals than you'd think, despite finishing in that wild card. Whereas, man, it does not pay to end up in that 3 spot in any division, because you're always playing a fantastic team, and it's every team in the playoffs, so they're all pretty even. But I'm wondering about the Carolina Hurricanes, because there's been a lot of talk about Ferland and the fact that they have some UFAs, but it looks like the way that they've been playing, that they're going to be, at least they're going to stand pat. Is there anybody that you think the Hurricanes might be in on, or any moves that they're looking to make? I don't think they're looking to move a Justin Williams or anything like that as their captain, but anything that they could be up to, maybe a goaltender. I don't know.
Man, they're a tough team to get a read on. They haven't really, you hear about other teams all the time, potentially making moves that they got to go after people. We consistently hear about the Nashville Predators and Winnipeg Jets, for example, needing to make a move. But, you never really hear the Carolina Hurricanes, right? They've kind of floated under the radar in terms of trade news. And, I know we've talked about him a little bit, and you haven't really heard his name come up lately, but a guy like Dougie Hamilton or Justin Falk, for example, who, they've been looking to, or they have the ability to maybe move one of these extra defensemen they have here and get a good forward in return. I think if there's any move to be made for Carolina, that's probably it. Unless, again, I wouldn't mind if they can maybe swing a 4th round draft pick for a goaltender maybe. But again, there's not a ton out there in terms of goalies that maybe I'm looking at right now and saying, okay, good, we can move him. Maybe, a Keith Kincaid, if you think he might be okay for you as an asset, you could maybe get him for a 5th or 6th round pick. But in terms of Carolina, maybe go after, you could potentially look at a guy like Gus Nyquist, maybe a Ryan Dzingel, excuse me, or a Zuccarello, maybe one of those guys. I think, you could possibly see them making a move for, but it's really hard to kind of pin down, because they could really use a forward that can score some goals more than anything else. But again, we'll see what they're going after here.
Yeah, to me, if I'm Carolina, I'm looking at this, I'm going, all right, we've had an impressive second half of the season, and that's all well and good. I'm gonna say I'm not sold on this team anyways. I've talked about it before, where I think when you're so far out of the playoffs, or the pressure's really off in terms of making the playoffs, that sometimes you play looser, therefore you play better. And then when push comes to shove, when you're right on the doorstep, which they've been on the doorstep a couple times, they can't seem to win that game to bump them over the edge. Even if they find themselves sitting in that last wild card spot, they fall back. And I think if I'm the general manager, if I'm Don Waddell, I'm looking at this and saying, We're going to leave it as it is because this group has managed to do something special here in the second half. So let's see if they can continue it. I don't want to disrupt any of the chemistry in the room. I just want to let them see what happens. And if we make the playoffs, great. If we don't, it's okay because we haven't given up anything. I look at this and see, if they give up a second round pick for somebody, or like let's say they're out and they try to get a Nyquist, or they go and they acquire a goaltender, give up a third or a second round pick for one, and then you just lost an asset that could bring you a pretty good player if you draft well. And so to me, where this team is at, I mean, what are you giving assets up for? You're 2 playoff games to go in and get absolutely whomped by the Tampa Bay Lightning. That's your prize. So let's see if they can do it on their own. And if they get in, great. You're probably going to get, whooped by the Lightning. And if they don't get in, then that's kind of what you expected all along. And you haven't given up any assets. And those assets are more valuable in the end anyways. So if I'm Carolina, I'm sitting still. Okay, let's go.
Well, let me throw out.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Real quick before we move on. Let me throw out one name, and I want to see maybe what you think about this move, because giving up assets to lose, in the playoffs obviously is never a good thing. But for the next couple of years, maybe a guy, for example, that I see on this list, Jeff Carter. Could you see him being a fit in terms of maybe a second-line center moving forward over the next couple of years for this team?
To me, Jeff Carter is only slightly better than Jordan Stahl right now. I'm not seeing it with Jeff Carter. I mean, I know it's hard to evaluate a guy when he's come off. It seems like he's always been hurt, and he had that big injury last year, and he plays on such a bad team. He has limited talent around him. It's really hard to evaluate him at this point in his career. But I think he's 33, right now. So I just think he's at that spot where he's maybe not a second line center anymore. He's trending towards being a third line center. I'll have to check on some WAR stats, and I'll get back to you where he actually is. That might just be my my gut saying that, and that the numbers might not actually show that. But it just seems like I don't know if he'd be a great fit in Carolina. You've already got a Stahl. You already have a Justin Williams. Like, do you really want to be this team that brings in a bunch of old guys just to barely make the playoffs? Because I don't think Jeff Carter pushes the needle very much for you.
Okay.
Obviously, you do. You think that's a move you'd make?
No, I don't think I make the move, but it's intriguing to me because I think their need for a center, and I think a guy with term could be a move that maybe they make to maybe get into the playoffs, just something for the fans, but then also sets them up maybe for the next couple of years to help them grow.
Okay. Yep, that's fair. Okay, let's go to the Pittsburgh Penguins, who have, of course, been really all over the place in terms of the standings, and they haven't really done a whole lot other than the what trade they made. They traded Blake. They acquired Blake Seibenaller from the Blue Jackets a couple of weeks ago, but the Penguins have been relatively still as of late. Not a whole lot of moves other than they shipped out Jamie Alexiak, and they've made these little small moves over time. But is there anything that you think the Penguins are going to try to do here?
Yeah, it wouldn't shock me. I mean, bringing in Nick Bjugstad was a nice little move, and I think that was probably their biggest deadline move, in my opinion. I do think they wouldn't mind bringing in a depth forward or maybe a depth defenseman, but nothing big. I mean, really, I think you could go after who would be a good name? I mean, just maybe an Adam McQuaid, or maybe somebody a little bit further on down the line, like a Tobias Reeder, maybe, if you want to even go that far. But again, I think they're just looking at depth moves at this point. Nothing big. For them, I think the big moves are done.
Okay. Yeah, my guess is there's a couple players who, I never count Pittsburgh out. Jim Rutherford, always looking to make a big move. He's not afraid to to really shuffle things up. And when I look at this team, I go, I mean, who are the players I'm not going to touch? I'm not going to touch Crosby or Malkin, obviously. At this point, Letang's playing well enough. I don't think you'd get anything that you can compare, especially with him being a right-handed defenseman. So Letang staying put, and then maybe a Getzel you're going to leave, and just the fact that Holmquist has such chemistry, and he's there for the playoffs. You know, there's those certain guys where you'll excuse a lesser regular season because you know what he brings to the table when all is said and done. And this Pittsburgh team, you know, they may not be good enough to even win a round at this point if they end up playing the Lightning, which is where they would be right now. But I mean, if I'm the Islanders, I don't really want to play the Penguins in the first round because the Penguins are going to flip a switch come playoff time. They know all they have to do is get in. They've gone on a lot of long runs over the years, so you got to be thinking that maybe some of this regular season is just them kind of being sick of the regular season. So to me, there are some moves out there that the Penguins could make, namely a goaltender if they don't feel like DeSmith is going to get it done in the playoffs. I think that Pittsburgh, even though there's nothing out there, I'm not hearing anything. I think that Pittsburgh could be in on a goaltender, even if it's just for this year. If it was to bring in a Jimmy Howard, or if it was to bring in a guy like, oh man, it doesn't really matter. You know, just somebody who's an unrestricted free agent isn't going to be there beyond this year. Just to go, hey, we've got. You know, Matt Murray, we'll just healthy scratch you. If you're not good enough right now, that's fine. We'll figure it out later, but we've got a playoff run to go on.
Yeah, I would not be surprised at all by that move, and I would agree with you. I think you look at, Tristan Jarry, 3.5 goals. Casey DeSmith and Matt Murray are treading close to 3 goals against the game as well, and I think, you know, if there's one area where maybe you could look and say, hey, we could use an improvement, that could be it, and you know, I mean, you could look at some other teams, like, for instance, the Colorado Avalanche, right? If they really don't feel they're going to make any noise or they're going to get in, you know, maybe you trade a Varlamov that way. You know, you could go a little bit further down the line, and you could look at a team like Anaheim, right? They've got 3 goaltenders right now: Gibson, who is on IR, Miller, and Chad Johnson. Well, Chad Johnson has proven in the past that he can be a decent goaltender, especially in the backup position. So I think maybe he could be somebody you could try to snatch out. And then even further down, like I mentioned earlier, Keith Kincaid. You could even look towards Toronto and maybe try to get a Michael Hutchinson out of there. But again, a couple options for you if you're the Penguins, maybe to go after.
Yeah, or maybe you really just look to shake the world up and you trade. You get Jeff Skinner to agree to an extension, and you go straight up Jeff Skinner for Phil Kessel, and you just shake everything up.
Wow,
that's what I'd do. Okay. Montreal is a team that we haven't talked a whole lot about, despite the fact that they've just quietly gone about their business. They're in there. They're 3 points ahead of the Carolina Hurricanes. They've got the Penguins as a cushion team. In reality, they really are only 3 points back of that third spot in the Atlantic. Boy, wouldn't that be a trip if Montreal could jump Toronto and ended up playing Boston, and Toronto ended up a wild card. I actually would. It's almost, you look at it and you're like, would I rather play Boston or the Islanders in the first round? But I think Montreal. Do you look at them as a team that will really try to make a splash? I know they've already come out and said we won't trade for a rental. We're not interested in guys without term, but they are interested in guys with term. So what does that mean for the Canadians? Will they make a move here, you think?
Honestly, I don't think so. I think maybe the only move I could see them making would be to bring in, for instance, like, one of Carolina's defensemen, for example, right? Like a Dougie Hamilton or Justin Falk, like we talked about, with term still on there, to maybe fill in that back end, because I do think, they've got a lot of good young pieces, not necessarily on the back end, but up front. And I think it would be, good for this team to just, maybe get in, see what you can do. And, not necessarily, like you said, look to add any big pieces, because I don't think the team expected to really be in the playoff hunt this year. And I think they're kind of ahead of schedule on where maybe they thought they would be. So if I'm anybody in Montreal, I'm kind of standing pat unless you can get a big name defenseman to come in.
Yeah, to me, it's exactly the same scenario as Carolina. You look at this team and you go, this isn't where we thought we'd be, but let's see what happens. We're not going to do anything drastic here because of the chemistry in the room. We just want to keep it the same. Let's keep this group together, and I think you have that conversation with your team. Some people say, well, they've played well enough, they deserve a rental. Well, that's stupid. How about, hey, they've played well enough that we don't think we need a rental. That can be out there too. We like the group we have. We don't want to disrupt what's going on here, and so we're not going to make a move here at the deadline. It's one thing to go and bring in a depth guy or something like that where you don't really give up much. But I don't think Montreal really makes much of a move right now. I think they're more of a draft, like make a move at the draft type of team. Is what you'll see.
Yeah, I agree. And, I think Montreal, their biggest handicap right now is their depth in terms of prospects, right? They don't have a ton of them. So if you're Montreal, you don't want to give up draft picks or what little prospects you have right now, because you're sacrificing, what little future you have in terms of, forwards and defensemen to bring up to help stockpile, talent around the guys that are developing quicker than normal.
Yep, exactly. And I mean, it's nice this team doesn't really have any free agents coming up. They'll just, Arturi Lehkonen, he's not going to get a whole lot. Joel Armia, so there's not a lot of contractual issues. I mean, Domi's up at the end of next year as an RFA, but Domi won't be a tough sign. So really, you're clear of all that stuff, and so it'll just be, can you acquire more assets? I think is what the Montreal Canadiens need to do. Let's go over to the Western Conference as we close out the show. The last 5-10 minutes or so. Let's talk this playoff run, which is, in reality, everyone from Vancouver up is in the playoffs. So Vancouver, Chicago, Arizona, Colorado, Minnesota, Dallas, all those teams could potentially make the playoffs, and only 2 of them will. Is there a move to be made for some of these teams that are, kind of making a late season run?
Boy, the big name for me is Dallas right now. That if there's any one team that needs to make a big move and bring in a big piece, it's them, because, they've been a team where the last, few years we look at them and we say, hey, this is a team that on paper you look at and you're like, man, they've got some talent. They should be making the playoffs, but for whatever reason, they just keep falling out. And it's guys underperforming, obviously, and the last couple seasons not really getting good goaltending, and now they're finally getting great goaltending, but their forwards aren't producing, right? Last year was quite the opposite. They were scoring a ton of goals, but they couldn't stop the puck. And so I think if you're Dallas, you look to make a move up front, right? You want to bring in a big name, and a couple guys that come to mind, obviously I mentioned his name earlier, Gus Nyquist. I think maybe if you can try to go out and snag Mark Stone, bring him in, because boy, would he look good on your second line or even maybe your top line.
Acquiring Mark Stone would be absolutely enormous. And actually, it's funny, in order to acquire Mark Stone, would you have to include Jason Spezza because right now the Dallas Stars have $522,000 of cap space. So someone's got to go the other way. And he has the exact same cap hit as Mark Stone. Do you have to? In order to acquire him, that's some of the reason why I'm wondering if the Stars are able to make a move because of what they have. I think Nichushkin could go the other way. I think you could see Ottawa saying, "Yeah, okay, we'll bet on Nichushkin, who only has a year left on his contract after this at $295." So you could see, a Nichushkin being involved in a deal, and what else are you gonna have to give up? Because you're gonna have to give up somebody pretty talented in order to bring him in. You might have to give up a Julius Honka, maybe an Essa Lindell. Are you willing to give up roster players, or are you just going, we're gonna give up a first round pick, which I also don't have a third round pick, so that leaves you with just a second and a fourth and a fifth and a sixth. They don't even have a seventh, so they don't exactly have a ton of of resources to spare either. And that, in terms of cap space and resources, I don't know if they have what it takes to bring in a Mark Stone.
No, I would agree a little bit in the fact that they're limited on cap space, but I think to get a deal done, you're going to be pretty close to what Duchene got, right? Maybe even a little bit better, I think. Now, I do think, if you include like a Honka and Nichushkin and maybe a couple good picks there, you could potentially get something done. But I do think in order to do it, Ottawa maybe has to keep a little bit of cap hit, back their way, a little bit of salary.
And I don't think
that this happen.
Well, I don't think Mark Stone's going anywhere. I think they're going to give him like 5 or 6 years at 10 and a half, something in there.
Ooh.
That'll get it done. He'll stay. I don't think he's going anywhere. I mean, you got to think in order for this guy to get his money. If he's the best player on the Ottawa Senators, that's the way to get the most money, is to be the best player on a team. If he goes to another team, he's not going to get the same amount of money. If he goes to a team like Dallas, they're not going to be able to re-sign him at the end of the year either. And I know that gives you the choice of the litter, but I get the sense that maybe he wants to be involved in this rebuild. And Matt Duchene just didn't have the same kind of skin in the game because he hasn't played there his whole career. So I do think that Mark Stone stays in Ottawa. So let's go. I don't even want to talk about the Minnesota Wild because they might trade Eric Stahl, but who cares if they don't? Paul Fenton is turning out to be a bust thus far with that Niederreiter deal. Everyone who's ever dealt Niederreiter feels like an idiot shortly afterwards. But we'll gloss over that. The Pacific Division. Obviously, the Vegas Golden Knights are securely locked in. I think they're 8 points up on the next team, on Arizona, for that third spot, but they're 11 points back of the second spot. So Vegas is going to be in the third spot in the Pacific, and they're either going to play San Jose or Calgary. And will either of these teams do anything to improve their chances, whether it's to move up in the standings, but also to win that first round? I mean, really, you've got to be thinking that both these teams want to win the division, because it's the difference of playing a Minnesota or maybe Colorado or Dallas or Chicago, or having to play Vegas, which is a huge shift in talent level. So do you think either of these teams are going to make a big move at the deadline?
Boy, I think both Vegas and San Jose are prime candidates to maybe go and look at a goaltender, right? We look at San Jose, a team that's loaded with talent up front and in the back end, and I don't think they make, any big moves there. I think maybe a depth move, on defense, maybe at the forward position might come in for, a sixth or fifth round pick, big whoop. Nothing that's going to really change their fate. But I do think, for a guy like we've talked about multiple times on the show, Martin Jones, who just, who I thought should have been better this season, given the talent in front of him, hasn't really been better. He would be a prime candidate to maybe say, okay, Jones isn't playing so well, let's go out and get a goaltender, who can, like a Jimmy Howard, for example, right? Who can come in, and we know he performs well in the playoffs. He's been putting up good numbers on a pretty terrible team this year. So let's go out and get a guy like that. That way, if, come game 2 of the playoffs, Martin Jones isn't cutting it, we can throw Jimmy Howard and maybe he can salvage a playoff run. Now, from a Vegas standpoint, I don't think they would be looking at a goaltender for a playoff run, but yet someone to give Marc-Andre Fleury a little bit of relief come down the stretch so that he's fresh for the playoffs.
Yeah, a guy we haven't talked about yet is a free agent. I think will be moved at the deadline despite having a no trade clause, is Ryan Miller. Ryan Miller he's been hurt much of the season, but I do think he can submit a 6-team trade list. That is his no trade clause. And I think being in Anaheim, San Jose is a prime candidate. I don't think he would mind moving over and that's that short drive over to San Jose, where he has a legitimate chance to win a Stanley Cup, and maybe could be the starting goaltender on that team if they needed him to be. I think this team is still going to go. I mean, we've put our eggs into Martin Jones this year, and we need to see if he can get it back. But bringing in a guy like Ryan Miller could shift their fortunes in that way, because I think Ryan Miller has been really great for John Gibson. And I don't think that's been stated enough, how important it is sometimes for a young goalie to have such a strong presence behind him who knows his role. And so maybe bringing in a guy like that, I don't think he'd be expensive, maybe a 3rd-round pick at most. And so, I think that Ryan Miller will be a great asset for whatever team brings him in. I don't know if Calgary does, because I would say that Mike Smith and Ryan Miller are maybe cut from the same cloth in a sense. They're both veteran goaltenders, and I think at this point, the way Rittich has played, I think you're just going to probably ride him in. And if you need to, you're going to play Mike Smith. Head coach will figure that out as they go along. But I don't know that Ryan Miller's a good fit in Calgary, but he could be also a good fit in Vegas. Just go behind Marc-Andre Fleury, and I think both those guys would get along. They're both veteran guys, and it would give them that depth at goaltender to where Fleury doesn't have to end up playing 75 games this year.
Right. Yeah, and I think from an Anaheim standpoint too, I really like this idea of moving Ryan Miller, only because now you've got a young goaltender who's shown up for a few games already this season and has looked pretty good doing it, in a guy by the name of Kevin Boyle. And again, it's a limited sample size, 3 games, but I like what I've seen out of him, and I think if you're Anaheim, this is a good opportunity, since you're not making the playoffs, to give him a look down the stretch and get him in for a few games with Gibson being hurt, and say, hey, let's really see what we got here.
I like it. St. Louis Blues, they look like they are now in control of that 3rd spot in the Central. Of course, Dallas could catch them, but they're really probably the only team that could. Do the St. Louis Blues do anything down the stretch? We thought maybe 4 weeks ago that this team would be selling everybody, and now it looks like they may become buyers, or will they just stand pat?
Boy, getting a forward wouldn't be a shock for me at all right now. I think, on the back end, I think they're all set. They don't really need to make any moves. I think if they want to maybe move out a guy like, a Carl Gunnarsson, or, maybe even Bouwmeester, if they get a good enough offer for a guy like that, sure, go ahead and move him. I don't mind that at all. But in terms of, their big guys like Dunn, Parenko, and Peter Angelo, keep those guys around. Don't move them, like we've speculated earlier on this year. And I think up front is where maybe they could use a little bit of help, because you see guys like Jaden Schwartz, Tarasenko finally catching fire, and I wouldn't mind getting a little bit more depth, a 3rd-line guy you can put up there to maybe relieve in some minutes from those guys down the stretch.
I like the idea of a guy like Zuccarello who can come in, he can play the wing. You don't need him to play center. And he can provide some speed. If this team lacks anything, it's speed. And so you just need a guy who, that Zuccarello can play a tighter system, because he did it in New York with Alain Vigneault, and he can play a defensive game. He's not a bad 2-way player, and so I think you look to acquire a guy that you can bring in that will fit. I think actually Gustav Nyquist would be a good fit as well. Anyone who can play the wing just to take some pressure off scoring goals from Tarasenko and O'Reilly would be key. But I don't know if this team really, to me, Jay Bouwmeester is their rental. I don't think they're going to move him, because I don't think you're going to get anything for him that is of significance. And so I say you just go, well, Bouwmeester, he's been here. He's playing better these last 20 games. And so I think you're okay with hanging on to him. Let's go last couple comparisons. The Winnipeg Jets, Nashville Predators, maybe the 2 teams outside of Tampa Bay that know they have a legitimate chance of winning the Stanley Cup today. Even if they did nothing, I think both of them have a legitimate chance. I know Nashville was big on Duchene, and it obviously didn't happen. And so what does Nashville do now to try and pull themselves even with Winnipeg and the Tampa Bay?
Well, I still think Nashville's going to go out and try to make a splash for a big name forward. Granted, we've talked about it. Duchene's gone now. They were huge on him. And, I think a guy like Ryan Dzingel, Kevin Hayes, for example, would fit nicely in their system. I think he's the type of player they would enjoy having there. So I think one of those 2 guys would be great. As terms, when we speak of Winnipeg, there's one position that we've talked about it all season long, and it's the center position on that second line. Now, I like Brian Little, but I like him better as a third-line center right now, and he's been playing good this season. He's been playing better than expected in my mind, but a couple names that maybe you could go out and you could get cheap that maybe could show up at the right time. Now that a guy like, for example, Patrick Laine is getting hot now. He scored 2 last night. He finally snapped that big 15-game goal drought. So maybe he starts getting he gets rolling. But a guy like Derek Brassard, right? Florida's not making the playoffs. I don't think Brassard is sticking around there because he knows he's never going to get more than third-line minutes as a center there. So, for a guy like Brassard, he'll likely be moved in Florida. It would not shock me at all. And I think, if you're Winnipeg, you could probably snag him back for maybe even a third-round pick, maybe a second round at best. And then, you've got a guy who has proven in the past he could handle second-line minutes, and you give him the opportunity to say, hey, show us what you can do.
Yeah, I don't hate that at all. I think that would be a good move on both sides. To me, Nashville, yes, they're looking for that center. Whereas, wow, I think you just had some dogs go ham, eh?
Yeah.
Whereas when I look at the Jets, yes, they would love to have that third line center. I just don't know if there's anyone. I guess that Kevin Hayes would fit in there because he's pretty fast and he can play a good two-way game. He would be a likely guy. There's Derek Brassard. He's gonna go and be what, a third line center. I guess he could be a second line center in Winnipeg, but that would be an interesting spot to me. Both these teams were high on Stone and Duchene, and I don't think they're going to get either one of them because I don't think Stone's going anywhere, and obviously Duchene is in Columbus, so. I think it's slim pickings from the center position. Maybe Marcus Johansson could go somewhere. To me, the interesting guy would be Eric Stahl. If you could get Eric Stahl moving from Minnesota, if Minnesota's willing to give him up and say, we're not making the playoffs, we're done, then it could get interesting. If Eric Stahl can find his magic from last year, go into to Nashville, I think would be a better fit for him than Winnipeg, although Winnipeg's nice and close to Minnesota, but... both those teams, it'll be interesting to see what they do because really the next couple days could seal their fate heading into the playoffs. So we will see what happens. So we will be back very soon. This was a nice long episode for you. So we'll see you guys next week as we find out what happens over the trade deadline. Justin, any last words?
Yeah, Panarin. Traded or staying?
Oh, man, you've got me doubting myself now. I guess he's staying.
Okay.
I the more I think about it, they have to do this. They have to keep him. Maybe if they win the Stanley Cup, he stays.
Okay.
Who knows? You don't know what winning will change. How winning will change somebody and change their tune. Maybe they can convince him to stay. Maybe John Davidson buys him a house on the ocean. So, all right. Well, that's our show. Let us know what you thought at OT Hockey Talk on Twitter. We will talk to you guys soon. Enjoy trade deadline day. And just in case you were wondering, no, I will not be on TSN's trade deadline